Strength in Leos.
What is up, everyone? How's it going? It's Evan back with the Strength in Leos podcast, here bringing you guys another awesome episode with another great guest. Super excited for this guest we have coming on. He's been on the podcast plenty of times now, has kind of set his mark on the podcast with all the great information from feeders to Leos, AFTs, which is another thing we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to have an all AFT episode. Super excited. And we have on Seth from Hoffpauir. So Seth, how's it going?
What's up, Evan? How's it going, man?
Good. Yeah, glad to have you back. We've been talking about this episode for a while now, so I'm glad we finally got to it.
Yeah, we've been trying to get together our schedules and get it done. I'm glad we finally made it happen.
For sure, yeah. And then talking about AFTs and things like that, and we've kind of seen your evolution over time. Really, just focusing on Leos and having a few AFTs, but now it's kind of switching the marks in terms of more AFTs than Leos. So how do you feel about that change, and just how's that going in general?
Yeah, this will actually be the first year that we're going to produce more fat tails than we produce Leos. And so that's kind of exciting. And that's not, we haven't slowed down or stopped producing Leos. We just finally got to the point of having a lot of our holdback female fat tails in rotation this year. And so, yeah, it's definitely a big step for us and an exciting part of the adventure for sure, because it's like I've always preached, start small, grow slow. Well, this is like that next step of the evolution where we're like blossoming out to a much bigger production, and it's just a matter of having so many different projects going on that there's a lot of need for a lot of numbers at this point. You know what I mean?
Right, exactly. When it comes to like AFTs and what you're doing over there, you eventually get to a point where you're doing so good on the smaller scale, it's just inevitably just going to get bigger and producing, more stuff, better stuff. You just kind of need that stock to have that in there. So it's awesome to just see you take those next steps and really just do what you're passionate about and continue to just grow the business in a lot of awesome ways.
Yeah, man, it just kind of happened on its own. My boys, as you know, have always been a big part of my collection and my operation, and they've always preferred the fat tails. They liked how much more calm they seemed, especially as babies. And it was kind of more our vibe, if you will, So some people say they don't like them because of their lack of personality. I'm totally on the opposite side of the fence. I love them because of their calm personality. I'll admit, they're not one of the smarter lizards or geckos out there. They're kind of dirty.
Right.
But all that aside, they're one of the few geckos, as far as a gecko goes, that will actually just kind of curl up in your hand and go to sleep if you let it. Most of them will. So that's kind of the big factor for me or for us that we've always liked, is how chill they are and how laid back they are. It's just been a natural evolution for us that we've focused more and more energy or space and time to the fat tail operation, and this is, like I said, just kind of the next step in the evolution for us in the fat tail hobby, if you will.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's awesome to see you making those big guy moves over there. Just working on increasing and doing amazing stuff with the AFT. So when it comes to African fat tails, let's start from the basics, right? It's a lot of our listeners work with leopard geckos and know what that's like. So in terms of care, what does that look like for African fat tails? How is it different? How is it the same?
Yeah, so there's obviously a lot of information out there for breeding and keeping leopard geckos, right? And, plenty of misinformation, but plenty of good information out there too. But one problem that I've always found and heard in the hobby is that there's not as much specific fat tail information out there. So that's kind of why, you and I have been talking about doing this episode. So most of what I'm going to go over, if I sound like I'm comparing to something, it's absolutely me comparing fat tails to leopard geckos, because the leopard gecko based knowledge is so easy to access on this podcast than others, other forms of media, that it's easiest for us to just kind of make the few comparisons that are a big difference that I found that work for me. as compared to just a typical leopard gecko breeding, hobby or production or operation, if you will.
Right.
So yeah, some of the main things that I've noticed. Let's see. Shoot, I sent you that list, Evan, and now I'm on my phone. So a lot of the things that there are is the fat tails need a little bit higher temp than leopard geckos, and that's something that is across the board. I've seen time and again. I've had people message me and say, "Hey, my fat tails will, my babies won't start as well on the dubia roaches or on this or that." And usually their temps are just like right at 88 or 90. And if they bump those temps up just a little bit, that seems to usually kick them in gear. So I found that instead of having such a wide temp window like leopard geckos do, because really you can have a leopard gecko anywhere in the mid 80s to 100 degrees, and they're gonna function just fine. A fat tail needs a little bit tighter window, so you really need about a 92 to 95 degree hot spot, and that's where they really seem to thrive on that. So that's one of the main things that I've found is that temperature change or temperature specificity. Just making sure that they are dialed in way more accurate than the leopard geckos, and that carries right along into the incubation, and we can get to that later. But it's definitely a big factor with them in getting them to thrive is having that hot spot and their ambient temp. You can't have too cool of an ambient temp either. I've had some customers that their hot spot was on point, but the rest of the cage was really cold, and the gecko was stressed out and just trying to stay on the hot spot and not leave any time. And so just increasing that ambient temp was the ticket for some of those. So
Gotcha.
that's definitely a big factor for them is the temperature and then the humidity, which is a little easier to manipulate. We just keep our humid hides a little bit wetter than the leopard geckos, so that pretty much it accommodates them there on the humidity.
Awesome. Yeah, and then when it comes to, I know feeders, there's a lot of confusion. Like some will say, like only crickets, they'll eat nothing else. There's just a lot of confusion when it comes to feeders of AFTs, and I know you have it pretty dialed down for what you do. So how do you deal with feeders, and what do you feel works best for you?
Well, and honestly, I think part of that is also kind of to do with the temps too. Like I said, because if you have them on the lower end of that range, then they might not be interested in anything, but the crickets will stimulate their food drive a little bit more, and they'll eat even if they're on that lower end. So but with that said, fat tails, without a doubt, some of them will just prefer crickets sometimes, even if they're raised on dubia roaches from babies. So for that reason, I start mine on dubia roaches. That way, they're a lot more, more likely to be versatile and feed, on different feeders. But even so, some of the babies that I raise, once they get older, especially the females, once they start ovulating, they get a suppressed appetite and they just need that faster moving food item. Some people have said that the red runners work for them. I've never used them personally, but actually, I think Heidi has mentioned that she uses red runners and her fat tails love them.
Yeah, she loves using those. Yeah, they're quick, easy.
Yeah. So that's another option there. But yeah, you definitely need to at least be open to using crickets if you're gonna use breed fat tails or keep fat tails on any medium scale. I definitely stayed away from it for a long time and fed only dubia roaches and was able to switch over a lot of fat tails that I bought onto dubia roaches, and I had good success with it, but it was a lot of work. And dubia roaches are a very expensive feeder too. So it in the long run, like whenever I was doing it on a much smaller scale, it was doable, and there was only a few geckos that I couldn't get to switch over, or that like maybe only during their breeding season they wouldn't want any dubia roaches and they wanted crickets. So I was able to feed crickets on a very, very small scale. Now, as many fat tails as I have breeding at this point, it's just easier for me to go mostly with crickets, and then my breeder females, whenever they're in season, they get dubia roaches in their bowl, and most of them will eat it. So they'll get crickets, cleaning day, and then they'll get dubia roaches in there too. So whenever they get hungry in a few days, they've got dubia roaches right there. Um, so that's kind of my go-to with the feeders on the fat tails. But I start my babies on tiny dubia, and then after they're going for about, I don't know, 3 weeks or so, then we offer them mealworms, and just like small to medium mealworms, and about probably 60 to 70% of them will take both, and those will get both. And then the ones that don't want mealworms, after we offer them a couple times and they keep refusing, then they just get dubia only. So
Nice.
that's kind of our routine on the babies as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, and it's probably way better than just feeding one staple feeder in terms of their health and making sure they're getting a little bit of everything. I know you do that with the Leos too, but
Yeah, varieties.
really good to get variety.
Variety's always best. Variety of your gut load for your feeders, variety for your feeders, your feeder bugs, definitely is the best way to go in any case.
For sure. Yeah, and you don't know what you're doing with that, we have a whole nother episode about feeder nutrition and all that good stuff that we've talked about before in the past. So make sure check that out.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. I think that might have been the first one we did together.
Yeah, I think so.
Actually,
I think you're right.
Yeah. Way back in the day. Nice. Well, when it comes to supplementation too, it goes right along with feeders. So how does supplementation work for just regular AFTs and also especially for those breeder females? That's a big one.
So yeah, it's definitely a little bit different than the leopard geckos. Most people, give a lot of calcium and then a little bit of multivitamin with the leopard geckos. I found and talked to other breeders and found, and they're seem to be on the same page that fat tails generally need a little more multivitamin, especially if you're breeding. So what I do is I have kind of a weird mixture that I'm doing. I do like I use the vitamin, I think it's vitamin A plus with the little, you know what I'm talking about, the Rapashi with the little frog on it. I use like 1 part of that to 10 parts of multivitamin. Okay. And then, so that's a mixture for my multivitamin. And then I take that mixture and I cut my calcium 1 part that to 5 parts calcium. And so I have those two mixtures on my shelf. So the calcium has a little bit of multivitamin and just like trace elements of that vitamin A plus. And then the multivitamin has a little bit of that vitamin A plus in it. So for my babies, every feeder gets dusted with that calcium mixture that has the little bit of multivitamin in it. Okay. And then the adults all get dusted. Every single feeder gets dusted about 1-to-1 ratio of that, the calcium and the multivitamin. So that's kind of my go-to, and that goes in all their bowls too for their free feed, and replaced weekly. So that's my vitamin routine on the fat tails. That's a little bit different than how a lot of people do and how I do my leopard geckos too. I don't give them as much of the multivitamin.
Got it. So is that's available for access at all time for the AFTs then?
Yes, but they don't really use it that much, Evan. So I leave it there for them, and some of my breeder females, whenever they're in their during their season, they'll use it, but the majority of them don't. I don't know if that goes back to them being a little more derpy than leopard geckos, or maybe they just I don't know.
Yeah,
there's something about it.
That's super interesting.
Yeah, they're not. Yeah, they're not as apt to use it like leopard geckos. But I will see.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes.
Okay. Yeah. No, it's definitely would be interesting to see like in the wild, like what that supplementation looks like and kind of the things that they're feeding on compared to leopard geckos and how they get those nutrients in there.
Right.
Yeah. Sweet. Well, when it comes to breeding, there's like so many things that goes into a breeding season with any reptile. Leopard geckos, we pretty much know how that works when it comes to breeding. So what does the season look like in terms of breeding, getting AFTs, and you have one that's up to size and ready to breed? What does that breeding process look like in terms of the season?
They grow a little bit slower than leopard geckos for starters. So I personally like to grow my fat tails out to 18 months. I don't even start looking for ovulations until they're 18 months. Maybe on a really, a much bigger female, I might start peeking at her at about, 16 months, but I want to see that 18-month mark on the most of them. And if it's a smaller gecko, I'll let her go 2 years before I even look for them. But typically they'll have, just like a Leo, they'll have about 6 to 9 months, they'll have their first ovulation. And some people will pump them up to big enough and breed them at that age and, stay on top of them through the season and, teach their own. But I personally have always preached and practiced waiting as long as you can. And that 18-month mark has been the ticket for me. The weight is a little bit less. If you're going that 18-month mark, then that weight is a little bit less of a concern, because typically by 18 months, they're all going to be 40 plus grams. But if it's like I said, if it's a smaller female in that 35 gram range, I might give her till 2 years just to make sure that I can't get a little bit extra weight on her, but it's other than that, it's pretty much the same. I put them with the male once they're ovulating, and I do leave them for a little bit longer instead of like just for an hour or so or just overnight like the leopard geckos. I'll leave them for 2 or 3 days a lot of times if they seem to be getting along. I do watch for compatibility whenever I first put them and make sure that she seems receptive. But that's one thing I've learned with the fat tails is the female, both the females and the males aren't nearly as much of a sure thing as with leopard gecko breeding. A lot of the females, they'll breed a couple times, they'll breed a couple seasons for you, and then they'll just take a season off, and then they'll be back in the game. I've got one girl that bred 2 or 3 seasons for me, and then now she has not bred for the last 2 or 3 seasons at all. She just will not. She's not receptive, and I don't know what the deal is there. I think that it's just kind of they're a little more hit or miss. So I've kind of geared towards playing the odds in my favor with that in mind, and just having several females for each project, and even the males sometimes aren't nearly as much of a sure thing on the breeding side of things. Even if you have a male that's aggressive for the first couple pairings, they might take a couple pairings and then be totally lazy after that and not interested at all, even though you've got another 2 or 3 girls lined up for them. So, with that in mind, I've got backup males for my backup males in a lot of my projects, to where if a male is getting lazy or it looks like he's kind of not interested, then I've got another one in that same genetic category, group that in a few weeks, if that female's still not showing like she's gravid at all, then I can put her with another male that might show a little more interest. And then I've got some males that are a little overeager and, will kind of basically attack the female as soon as I put them in. So I kind of have to buffer them off whenever I first introduce a female to them. So it's kind of all over the place for me with my collection. And again, this is all just how I've found in my collection personally. It's not necessarily the only way to do things or the only way of anything. It's just what's working for me. But that's what I've kind of found with what I've done in the last several years.
Yeah, definitely sounds like a spectrum where you could have some males or females that are really awesome in terms of what they're doing, and then some that are more on the lazy side. But I think that also probably plays into a lot of the misconceptions you hear with AFTs. You just might hear one end of the spectrum where it's like, okay, everyone needs to get AFTs. They're all awesome. They're amazing feeders. They're prolific, blah, blah, blah. And then you have these few outliers on the other end where it's like AFTs suck. They're not producing anything. They're super hard to deal with in terms of care and breeding and things like that. So it's awesome that you're at that point where you've had a big enough sample size. You've been doing it for long enough where you've seen everything. You have tons of connections in the hobby. So you've been able to talk to just a lot of people when it comes to all the experiences that you could have with these species.
I think you really hit the nail on the head there, Evan, because some people will get a trio and they'll have great success. And they're like, oh, these things are super easy. I'm producing the heck out of them, and they're all eating dubia roaches and worms for me, and no hiccups at all, and that's awesome. But I think you're exactly right. It's just there's such a spectrum of them that then you'll get those other people that get a trio or a pair, and they're just throwing their hands up in the air and can't get them to eat anything and can't get them to lay anything, and just really struggling with them. And so I think you're exactly right there in that you get a lot of both ends whenever you're talking to just individuals a lot of times. But I definitely see that it's by far more challenging than working with leopard geckos. And that's what I love about it, honestly, other than, the personality and the colors and the just overall attitude of them is what drew me to them initially, but more so now it's the challenge of doing things not necessarily that haven't been done with them, but just doing things in a different way with them. Does that make sense? Like I'm
Yeah.
I'm I'm focusing a lot of energy on most of my projects in like wild caught outcrosses and like an insane amount of wild caught outcrosses. I've got so many just normal hets on my racks right now, Evan. It's ridiculous, but they've all got different hets for different projects, and they're all going to be valuable to certain people that are looking for those puzzle pieces to build a project with. And that's kind of what
For
I've
sure.
geared my majority of my production to, is kind of having a really expansive library of genetics that I can plug everything into, and have all these different outcrossed gene pools that have a lot of fresh genetics in them, so that I can help set people up for success. Because I just feel like that's really the best thing that I can do as a breeder, is try to not just produce really pretty stuff, because that's definitely a part of it. I want to produce really pretty stuff, and I would love to produce stuff that nobody's ever seen before, or nobody's ever produced before, or like a different style of something that is just blows people away. That's everybody's goal, right? But at the end of the day, I want to be able to help other people produce really cool stuff. And if I'm just selling them pretty stuff that is going to turn around and not produce for them, or going to just fall on their face and not produce well, and that's not to say that I can guarantee everything that I sell, as it's going to, the deal. It's animals, you're taking a chance anytime you buy an animal. But I'm definitely doing a lot of work on my part to try to make sure that people are having their best foot forward if they're starting a project with animals from me. So that's kind of my general drive and lane that I'm trying to stay in on this front.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing I really appreciate about you, and just the way that you love educating people and really walking with people through the whole process of what it takes to, even if they have no idea, like they've done their research, they know about the care and things like that, but if they want to get into breeding, you're really great at just figuring out what people want, and being able to cater to them and the kind of situation that they're into in terms of projects, the kind of colors that they're looking for, and really guiding people in that way, and just really shooting it straight with them, like not sugarcoating things. But yeah, sometimes it might be hard to breed this female, or even this project, like, hey, this is a super awesome project, but like, there's definitely morphs that aren't viable and things like that. So I really appreciate just your honesty. And I think everybody has pretty much seen that throughout your time owning their business and dealing with reptiles and things like that.
Thanks, Evan. It's definitely something we
Yeah,
strive for, just in general.
yeah, for sure.
Before we go on, I want to say thank you to our sponsors. Impeccable Gecko is a small to mid-sized family-operated hobbyist breeder operation. They specialize in leopard geckos with high-quality genetics. Their goal is to provide customers with the absolute best animals that they can produce, coupled with honest and transparent business methods. At Impeccable Gecko, integrity and animal welfare are above all else. Impeccable Gecko is a strong supporter of the Strength in Leos podcast, so follow them on social media and check out what they have available. John of Gecko Boa started early, like most of us, catching lizards and snakes in his backyard at any chance he got. Over the years, he has kept and bred more than 80 species of reptiles. In recent years, his focus has turned to specializing within the genus Eublepharus. He has worked hard to pioneer some of the most cutting-edge leopard geckos while maintaining genetic purity and honesty. He also keeps the most diverse collection of pure Eublepharus species in the world. He has coordinated with biologists around the world and has contributed DNA sampling and distribution range info to help sort out the cladistic relationships within the genus. Check out geckoboa.com for more info and available geckos. Suburban Geckos is operated by Chris Charlton. Chris's passion and enjoyment for herpetoculture, and more specifically leopard geckos, drove the desire to take his hobby to the next level. With experience in breeding and raising reptiles well over 20 years, Chris is dedicated to producing quality animals for both the hobbyist and breeder alike. Suburban Geckos treats each animal with the utmost care and respect, and cuts no corners when it comes to health and integrity of their geckos. What started off as just a couple aquariums has grown into quite the collection in just a few years, and they wouldn't have it any other way. The dedication to their animals is unparalleled and evident in the quality and health of their animals that they produce. Exemplary customer service is another area where they excel. They're readily available to answer any questions you may have regarding their animals, husbandry, and etc. For more info and to see their availability, check out suburbangeckos.com. Blizzy-billed Leos, while new to the scene, is taking strides in following the footsteps of top-tier breeders and keepers in care and ethics while aspiring to bring fresh looks and crosses to explore latent potential. Prior to becoming a breeder, Greg of Blizzy-billed Leos completed hours of extensive research on lines, ethics, morphs, and how certain traits interact with others in order to begin projects which are coming to fruition already in the second season of breeding. With a major focus on line breeding the correct way and customer service done right, Blizzy-billed Leos aspires to be a breath of fresh air to the customers and keepers they encounter. Be sure to check out their Instagram, Blizzy-billed Leos, and stay up to date on project development, availability, or just tips on having healthy animals in your care. Dab Exotics is a hobbyist breeding operation that was started in 2017. They specialize in producing healthy leopard geckos from top quality genetics. Dab Exotics is an awesome supporter of the Strength in Leos podcast, so follow them on social media and check out what they have available for sale. Shane Kelly is a blue-collar, working-class guy that has a reptile breeding business with his wife and kids. They are currently working with high-quality ball python morphs, western hognose snakes, and select leopard geckos with a focus on bold stripes, and they're looking forward to adding Albie Snow and Ghost this year. They have been listening to the podcast since the beginning and are proud to be a Season 4 sponsor. Go check out their social media, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and also check out their morph market to see what they have available.
I know another thing that we kind of mentioned before, and something you wanted to bring up is the pooping in the lay box situation. So can you, what's all that about?
Other than the whole cricket thing, that crickets is something that turns a lot of people away from fat tails, which is, like I said, why I try to cater to that a little bit with the feeder source. But yeah, one other thing that is very specific to fat tails, and I haven't talked to anybody else that has this with any other species, but about probably 90% of the females, they're just like leopard geckos. They'll have a spot in their enclosure that they poop in. Well, once the female lays her first clutch of eggs, she will start pooping in her humid hide on top of that pile that she buried her eggs on. And even after you pull those eggs, and even if you change the substrate, she will continue pooping in there for the whole entirety of the season. And it's literally about 90% of them that'll do this. And so it's really, really weird. And I don't know what it is that makes them do that. I've got a couple of theories, and I've talked to them with people that are way smarter than me. Talked about them, with people that are way smarter than me. And the two theories that I have is, and my main theory that I think is to attract microfauna. And my thought process there is that if you have a bunch of isopods and springtails, and they are in a bioactive aquarium, and say you have a crested gecko or whatever, and it lays a clutch of dud eggs, those microfauna are going to consume those eggs and keep that environment clean, right? But if it lays a clutch of healthy eggs, they're not going to mess with it at all. They're not going to hurt a clutch of healthy eggs. So my thought is it could possibly be to attract microfauna so that the microfauna will dispose of any dud eggs and help keep the healthy eggs clean. Some other people have said maybe it's to deter predators, which also makes sense. I don't know. Either one of those theories makes sense to me. Maybe it's both. Who knows? But it's definitely, and it's definitely not awesome because, you have to keep their humid hide pretty wet, wetter than Leo's. And so what happens,
right,
that stool doesn't get a chance to dry up like it does in a typical leopard gecko, enclosure. In typical leopard gecko enclosure, it would dry up and, the flies can't really do much with it or lay eggs in it and have that whole process be viable. So what it does is it makes it to where you got to be a lot more on top of, going through and cleaning them out. What I do is I go through my laying females at least an extra time. Like if I'm maintaining them once or twice a week, then I'll go through them an extra time in between and just kind of scoop out, I'll just reach in with a glove and scoop out the excess of substrate to where I'm not really touching the stool at all, and then I end up having to replace the substrate. You know, I run out of substrate eventually over the course of the season and have to replace their substrate several times throughout their lay season. But yeah, big pain in the butt, and I don't know how to get around it. I'm tinkering with the idea of trying to set up like a more bioactive breeder setup, which could be difficult, but it's doable. So that's kind of my thought process there in the future, is to try to move towards that, something like that. But other than that, yeah, it's definitely a pain in the butt. And so once they're finished with their season, what I do a little bit for a week or two and let them pick a new spot in their cage. And then a lot of times, probably maybe half of them, whenever I put their humid hide back, first I'll put them a new, fresh, clean humid hide with no sin on it. When I put them a fresh humid hide back, then a lot of times they'll stick to that new spot. So that's the only workaround that I found there. But then I've got a handful of girls that all the time, 24/7, just lay in their humid hide. And so those girls,
Man, that's annoying.
whenever
Especially during the breeding season and cleaning things out, and
yeah, I mean, they have to have it right to be able to shed well,
right.
You know, unless you have a more humid bioactive setup in general. So what I do is those girls that continue that all season, they get paper towels in their humid hide for their off season. That way I can keep
Okay.
a little bit lower cost humid hide for them, you know, not having to go through substrate every week or two. And then whenever they're ready for laying season, then I put substrate in their humid hide. So that's about all I figured out there. If anybody has any better fixes or ideas to that, please, I'm all ears.
Yeah. I hope Seth figured this out. If anybody has any solutions.
For sure.
Nice. So we got copulation going. The female's gravid now, and you got eggs, and you know that's super exciting. Obviously, you got the eggs going, and then it's time for incubation. So, what does that incubation session look like in terms of temperatures, humidity? How different do you keep it from Leos, all that good stuff?
So let me back up one more real quick. I forgot to mention something though with fat tails. One thing with them, and it's kind of you know how it is. Everybody thinks it's all rainbows and butterflies and puppies and kittens. You know, there's darker sides of breeding hobbies, and with the fat tails, that's part of it. Is the females really take a lot harder to their season, and that's part of the reason why I grow them out longer, like I do, is because they, in between clutches, some of them don't miss a beat, but some of them really, really do have a hard time. And I mean, to the point that I've had some that I'll breed for a season or 2 seasons, and then I'll retire them because they don't recover well enough in between clutches. And even if it's a special project or whatever, it's just not worth the energy that it's taken on that female and the drain that it's taken on her. So
right.
You have to be very in tune with your females if you're breeding, and very on top of their nutrition, and make sure you're feeding the hell out of them. And so that's one thing there that I just want to mention. Other than supplementation and all that, you just got to be like always offering them food, because they might only accept food 1 or 2 days in between laying those clutches. And so you got to be Johnny on the spot on those couple days. You know what I mean?
Cool. Yeah. No, it's great info.
Because you can't just leave mealworms in there like you can with most leopard geckos. You know, it all goes back to just the different intricate workings of them, of being different. And I think that's where a lot of people get into trouble, is getting into fat tails thinking or assuming that they're the same as Leos or even similar to Leos. I mean, you can keep them in similar habitats to a degree, but they're definitely, you do yourself a favor by knowing what you're getting into and being, knowing what you're expecting whenever you get in.
Yeah. Because it's dangerous, right? You've seen it a billion times, I'm sure, where people are on Facebook groups and they're like, "Oh, I have like an awesome leopard gecko, and it's actually a fat tail gecko," and then vice versa, and just a ton of messed up stuff with that.
Yeah, lots of misinformation out there, and that's hopefully what we're able to help with, stuff like this, and get good information out there to people that can use it to their advantage in their hobby. So yeah, back to incubation. That's one thing that's also very different, or somewhat different, than leopard geckos, and where I think a lot of people run into trouble and get very frustrated in their first couple seasons, because if you think about it, most people are typically, if they buy into a project, they're going to want to incubate for a lot of females for their first year, right? That's just kind of general reptile breeding, procedure. So a lot of people will hear, oh, well, yeah, you incubate fat tails the same as leopard geckos. Well, you can in a sense, but not really, because leopard geckos, most people incubate their females at 80 degrees, maybe 82 degrees at the highest.
Yeah.
Well, fat tails, I have personally found that anything below 83 degrees, a lot of times will end up being fatal, like late term. Like they'll incubate fine all the way to the last couple weeks, and then they'll either die or they just won't. I have a lot more failure to hatch at that 82, 83 degree mark. Once I bumped it up to 84 degrees for my temp sex females, I still get 100% temp sex females on my fat tails, and I get way better hatch rate on my females. So I think that 83 degree threshold is really, really important. And it kind of makes sense if you think about the adults needing, 92, 93 degrees instead of 88 degrees.
Right. So, yeah.
That's one thing that I think a lot of people get frustrated with is that they'll end up losing a lot of their first couple years of hatches late term and kind of just beat themselves over their head, not knowing what's going on. And then another thing is the males. I've found if you're incubating at around 89, 90 degrees, it'll revert back into that female, tip sex. So just like the leopard geckos will do, when you get up above 90 degrees, you'll get back into a lot of females. I think we just have a smaller window with the fat tails. So instead of 80 to 90, like you have with leopard geckos, I incubate 84 to 88 on my fat tails. So that's only a 4-degree window. And I have 100% temp sex female accuracy. And my males, I do struggle with sometimes. It's usually about a 60% accuracy rate on my temp sex males. So I'm still kind of trying to tweak that a little bit, but that's about as good as I've gotten there. So that's definitely a big factor there. Another thing is their humidity level. I've hatched less and less tail truncations and spinal deformities as I've increased how much humidity I start out with on my egg setup. So I used to start out with I used the clay substrate, right? And so you soak it and then strain it and then just cup it out. And I used to just do that. And then a lot of times towards the end of the incubation process, maybe 3 weeks or so before hatch, I would need to add some hydration to them. You could see the rocks starting to dry out a little bit, right? And I was getting a lot of tail truncations and spinal deformities. Well, I started going to a higher water content. So I do the same process, but then I add about 6 cc's of water to each cup because I do the little portion cups and incubate each egg per cup. I add about 6 cc's to that cup whenever I set the eggs up. And that way I don't have to add hydration at all. It stays with just a little bit of water down in the bottom of those rocks. And I'm guessing that is what's really improved my success rate on tail truncations and spinal deformities. I still get them, but not nearly as often. I mean, a huge, huge, huge amount less. So that's one thing there is they need a little bit higher hydration, I found, and a little bit smaller temp window. And I would assume a little bit tighter temps as far as fluctuations. Even if you're shooting for that 84-degree mark, try to keep it as good as you can. I've upgraded to custom, wine cooler type incubators, and I don't know that it gets any better than that because that's the best insulation that I've found. You got a glass front to be able to monitor them and not open it all the time to check on babies. And if you build it right, it's got great heat distribution to where you don't have any hot spots or anything. So that's really what I've turned to is using those. And I think that those couple factors have probably improved those issues I was talking about as far as having the tail truncations and whatnot. But I really
it also just makes your job easier, right? You're not having to check deli cups like every day, that kind of thing, and you don't have to miss going in and out of incubation, so it makes your job way easier.
Yeah, that's also part of why I do the single egg incubation, or a lot of people do single clutches in those same portion cups. That way, once I put that egg away, it's done. I don't have to mess with it. I look at it all the time and make sure it looks okay. But I mean, that's one thing we can go over real quick, Evan. It's not specifically fat tail related, but that's a big mistake I think a lot of new breeders make is messing with their eggs too much. Taking them out, candling them, even just opening the box too much. Especially if you have a chart and you know when that egg should be hatching. If you've got the right amount of airflow in that cup, which I use tiny pinholes. Some people burp their cups. I have gotten away from that and like the pinholes method. But if you've got the right amount of airflow in that cup and you've got the right amount of hydration in that cup, there's absolutely no need to mess with that cup during the incubation process. And all you're doing in doing so is risking damaging that egg or damaging that embryo and causing issues. Because if you think about it, if there is an issue, there is absolutely not a damn thing you can do about it by candling it and looking at it and looking for movement or taking it out or changing the temperature and all that. All you're doing is risking damage. Agreed?
Yeah, for sure.
So that's one thing that I've really like talked to a lot of people about. Like anytime somebody's, messaging me with questions and stuff and I can see that they're messing with their eggs a lot, I right away, I'm like, hey, stop, please. Just open your ears and let please just I didn't mean it like that, like just please open your mind to this concept of you can't help them at all. You're not going to fix anything. You have to just let them be. And if you get that mindset going, then you're going to have a lot better success because you're not going to be doing that damage in the long run, or having the potential to do that damage. So if you have everything set up right and you do all the right steps and you have the temperature right and you have the humidity right, just leave them be. Set them and forget them. So that's why I like the single egg incubation method, because once I put them, they're done. If the egg goes bad, it goes bad. But I know that there's nothing environmentally that made that egg go bad. It wasn't another egg that made it go bad. It wasn't a clutch mate that rolled it that made it go bad. All that's out the window. I have all those factors eliminated. So that's why I like that method. Yeah.
Yeah, and if anything, you're just really making it worse. Like checking on the cups and everything. There's nothing you could really be doing at that point to help the eggs incubate
100%.
faster.
But I'll get off my soapbox there. I just wanted to put that up because I wanted to put that out there for people because I think that's a huge. I made that mistake. I'm sure you did too, Evan.
Yeah, for sure.
So many.
It's like so hard to. You're just excited. You know what I mean?
The hardest part is the patient part. In that incubation process, and like you so badly want to just see what's going on and watch it happening, and, but just think about it. In the wild, that thing is buried and left alone and not messed with at all until those babies are ready to hatch. And that's what you need in your incubation process, is it just being buried and put away. So that's what I recommend there, is just kind of really getting in that habit of having a method to where you're not having to mess with them a bunch and you can just kind of leave them. I do rotate my eggs to kind of make sure I always have the newest hatches in the front. But it's a very delicate process and I really sit down and focus on it. It's not something I do just haphazardly, because again, I've made mistakes there and learned from them. So.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I might've missed it. I don't know if you mentioned it or not, but in terms of incubation temperatures and hatch dates, how long does it take for incubation at the different degree levels?
So the males at that 88 degrees, they go about 45-ish, 45 to 50-ish. And then the females at that 84 degrees, they go about 65 to 72-ish. So
okay,
longer than
nice.
Leos, just maybe a week or so longer than Leos, or I guess the males are about 2 weeks longer than Leos, but not too far off.
Okay, nice. Yeah, that's awesome. Like get the eggs going. Yeah, super similar in that way too. So it's nice. There's not too much hard work, I guess, that you have to go through with that kind of stuff.
And then when they hatch, Evan, I set them up. I set my Leos and fat tails up literally identical. I put a folded paper towel. We fold the paper towel in 3 ways, so where it's just a third. We put that all the way in the back of the tub. And then we put another paper towel on top of that. And that folded paper towel is just to hold a little bit of extra hydration. And I found that's good even with the leopard geckos. That way you can spray them once in the morning, and then that's going to have enough hydration held throughout the day without being all soppy wet back there, right? And then we just keep them at, like I said, about 92 degrees on their hot spot, and a fresh water dish in the front, a little hide across the heat in the back. A very simple setup to where they don't have a hard time finding any food, and they'll have a hard time finding their water, and they can just kind of spend those first couple weeks just kind of, getting their yolk absorbed and learning how to eat. And then once we see, just like with leopard geckos, once we see their first stool, we offer a counted out amount of dubia, and then as soon as we see that they accepted, then we mark on the tub that they're eating, and off to the races with them. Yeah, it's very, very similar in that sense. I do, but with that said, I probably keep my leopard geckos a little bit differently than some people too. I introduce humid hides to all of my baby geckos. Right around a month old, they get a humid hide. Basically, once they get moved off of one rack onto the next rack, they get transferred into a little bit different setup where they have a humid hide in there, and that way I don't have to worry about spraying them once they get off of that rack. So I just have a set couple of racks that I spray every morning, and everybody else is on humid hides that are maintained every other day. So yeah, it's definitely a process we've got going on, but it's not a very complicated process compared to how a lot of people keep their leopard geckos. It's just the way I like to explain it to a lot of people is many people can get away with keeping and even breeding leopard geckos in a neglectful manner, and you can't even tell it a lot of times by looking at the adults or the babies, in most cases, just because they're such a ridiculously hardy animal that just you almost have to try to hurt. Whereas the fat tails, they'll definitely show if they're being neglected. If they're not hydrated enough, you can tell. If they're not being fed enough, they have a little bit higher metabolism, I find, and they need to be fed a little more often. Like I said, especially with the females breeding, they can go down hard. So you got to be a little more on top of them. And same thing with the babies. You can't be as kind of haphazardly or forgetful as some people kind of get away with raising babies. And that's not to, again, that's just, everybody does things their own way. It's just, these guys really need a steady hand. So.
Yeah. And I know that you kind of have it dialed down so much of the fact that I know the kiddos are helping setting up babies and you don't like dealing with, finicky feeders, and it's not really a big issue from what I've heard in your collection. So you really just have it dialed down, which is super awesome to hear
Austin's
about.
in charge of the first two racks, so he gets them started, and then anytime he has a slow starter that isn't just eating on its own right away, he draws a little red heart on it, and so then I go through the rack every day, and anything that has a heart on those couple racks, then I'm giving attention to and helping get them started. Just be it tongue feeding or hand feeding, or some of them just need a little bit of help. Just like with leopard geckos, sometimes you just have to help assist feed them for 2 or 3 feedings, and they're like, oh, that's what you do with these bugs, and then they're rolling.
Yeah.
So we have a pretty good system there to where they've got me as a strong support system and a very close overwatch on the whole operation. It's not like my kids are raising all these geckos all by themselves, and it's definitely a very involved operation between the three of us. And yeah, it definitely works out. We've got a good system going, and it's very consistent for the babies, to where the babies are getting every other day care nonstop. Even if I get busy with normal life things and dad duties or whatever, I know that the babies are taken care of. The young babies are taken care of because the boys that's in their daily routine. So.
Yeah. No, I always joke I'm going to go down there and then in my carry-on, I'm going to accidentally take one of them. So.
That's funny. Hey, they're not cheap. I'll tell you that. It's not free labor. And it's
throw a few mealworms, a few dubia. Make sure the hotspot's all right. No, I'm joking.
Just there.
Sweet. Yeah. And then also it's like, dude, morphs galore over there. Like tons of awesome morphs and crazy projects to get into. You've specialized in a lot of cool projects. So yeah, like what is that like in terms of genetics and how that differs? I know there's a ton of recessive traits.
I'll try to go with it off the top of my head. Help me out, Kevin, because I think you have the list that I sent you to make sure I don't miss anything.
Yeah.
But so you've got. We'll start with the codom is whiteout, and whiteout is my personal favorite gene. And now, little side note there. I think everybody should take a minute from this episode and go back to our first episode that we did about fat tails and listen to the episode about the issues that I found in a certain line of whiteouts that I was working with, which was very, very specific to that certain line of whiteouts that I had in my collection. In hindsight, after that, I have not seen any issues at all with any of the lines of whiteouts that I'm working with to date. So the whiteouts, the reason that they're my favorite is because of the variety that they throw in expressions. So you've got some whiteouts that don't look a whole lot different than normal, and you've got some that just look insane. Like you've seen Skittles, my favorite. She's my mascot. Actually, she's
crazy
on my logo. So the whiteout gene is an incomplete dominant gene, meaning it has a super form. The super form is kind of similar to the lily white gene in the crested geckos. The super form can incubate all the way full term, but then they either don't hatch, or after they hatch, they die within like an hour of hatch. Every single one of them. And plenty of people have tried. Nobody's been able to successfully do it. I promise you we would have heard about it if somebody had pulled it off. But people are still trying, I promise you. I've never personally tried. Generally, most people just stay away from whiteout to whiteout pairing because that completely avoids that possibility. So you just set up your breeding groups appropriately, either a whiteout male or whiteout females. I tend to go whiteout females because I do things backwards and I like being extra and expensive, because it would obviously be more economic to set up with a whiteout male, right? Because, you're paying for that genetic, and that's an incomplete dominant genetic that you can spread to everything you pair them to. But then you can only keep so many because you can't put whiteout females to that male, so you would end up having to have another group if you wanted to keep some of the whiteout females. So I end up setting a lot of groups up with a non-whiteout male and whiteout females. That way I can keep whatever I want because I tend to like to hoard sometimes.
As we all do.
But anyway, so it's an incomplete dominant gene. It's an amazing gene. It has all kind of different expressions. It's great when you mix it into other recessives. The basic visual traits that the gene brings is it breaks up the pattern and it creates a lighter background. Sometimes it's a stark white background. Sometimes it's like a tangy marbled background. It just depends on how it expresses. But it breaks the pattern up and it brings a lighter background is the main things it does. Additionally, sometimes you'll get some that like my mango project. One of the main things that I focus on with that project is animals that hold a lot of bluing in their tail, because some morphs will get bluing in their tail like at a certain age and then it'll kind of gray out, and some morphs will kind of hold that blue a little bit more intensely throughout their adulthood. So that's another thing that whiteouts can do sometimes is keep a little more of that bluing hanging in there.
Dude, the stuff that you have from your mango project, like that blue, like it's insane. If you guys haven't seen it already, like you have to check it out. It's literally insane.
Thank you. It's definitely one of my projects over here. Yeah. And it's a total accident. I've told you the story about how that project started, right? It was like,
right. Yeah.
I had only a select few males. And remember I mentioned earlier how some males will be lazy. I had a certain male lined up for a female, and she was ovulating and he was not interested at all. And I was like, okay, well, I guess I'll make my own whiteout A-males because she was a whiteout, but she was het Oreo patty. So I put her to A-male, male, because that's all I had was another A-male as far as males went. And so that wasn't even like a logical pairing as far as genetics go, right? Now, today, people are actually pursuing that triple combo, the A-male patty Oreo combo. So that's worked in my favor now because I've got a bunch of animals from that original project that are all like possible het Oreo, possible het patty. But anyway, my original goal with the project was to create a whiteout A-male of my own. And the first generation that hatched from it were just so amazing looking and unique looking that I just ended up continuing on with kind of a side project with that. And that's where the mango project spawned. But anyway, enough with that little side rant. What were we talking about? Genetics. So
genetics. So we got stripes too, right?
Yeah, the stripe is the other. It's the incomplete dominant, or well, it's a dominant, but I personally think it's probably an incomplete dominant. But you can't really tell the difference between a super stripe and a non-super stripe because they're just going to look striped.
Okay.
But there are animals out there that seem to throw 100% stripes. So that leads me to believe that it's probably an incomplete dominant, right? To where you have superforms out there that will throw 100%. So that's it. Everything else is recessive. So you've got, I'm just going to list them off and then we'll go back through them. You got caramel, you got ghost, you got amel, patternless, Oreo, Zulu. Is that it?
I think that's it.
6 recessives. Yeah. What do I have on that list that I sent you,
Evan? So we got Oreo, amel, patty, Zulu, caramel, ghost.
Yeah, that's it. Okay.
Yeah.
So 6 recessives. And going through those, they all act totally like they should, simple recessive, with the exception of patternless has some visual markers on some of the hets sometimes, and we'll get to that. But we'll start with the caramel and the ghost. And the reason I want to start with those is specifically because they're kind of tricky to work with, because the visual females of both of those morphs are infertile in one way or another. The visual caramels will lay eggs, but they'll always be duds. In my experience, and everyone I've ever talked to, I think I've talked to a single person overseas that claimed that they had a fertile caramel female that laid eggs, which I would be very interested in working with, but that's literally the only person I've ever talked to about it. Then ghost, they're actually even more dangerous to try to breed, because they will, and I've never tried to breed a ghost, but they will produce follicles. It'll look like they're producing eggs, and then they'll just end up either resorbing them, or they'll like totally fail and get egg bound, and people have had issues and lost females trying to breed them. Are you still with me, Evan? Okay. You scream with me. Yeah, I can hear you. I just can't see you. Your screen went black.
Okay.
So that's the ghost and caramel tricky. The tricky spots of the ghost and caramel. The visual females are infertile. So for that reason, any visual females that we produce, we sell as pet only, with full disclosure of why that is being sold as a pet only. So moving on from that, and they look just like they sound, Evan. The caramel, the bands are a darker caramel color, and the background is like almost a pink. And then the ghost coloration, well, I guess the ghost doesn't look like it sounds. Well, it kind of does, because they look almost like they're in sheds sometimes. But they have, there you are. You were gone for a minute. Your video just came back. The ghost almost have like a purple hue to them, and they're really hard to describe, actually. It's a really unique look for an animal. They've got like a purple and orange hue to their coloration, to where the background is more of a lavender, and the banding is hang on, I'm gonna just get one out and show you real quick. Actually,
yeah, sure.
They're so difficult to describe. The ghost is. Actually, I was even describing it wrong. So the background coloration is more of an orange, or like pumpkin color almost, and then the banding is like a kind of a purpley. But that animal isn't in shade right there. That's his normal coloration. Isn't that cool?
Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah. Almost looks like a toy. It's crazy.
Like pastel coloration, right? So that's the ghost, and then you have let's see, what else? At the amel. So the amel is just that's kind of one of the first genetics that were imported. By the way, cool fact about fat tails: most of the genetics, everything but the whiteout, were all imported and reproduced in captivity, as opposed to a lot of leopard gecko genetics that just kind of popped up in collections. Most of the fat tail genetics started getting imported like around 2008, 2009, and then have been reproduced from there. I'm not sure what year the AML started coming in. It might have been before that. But anyway, the AML was one of the first genes to be discovered, and that has a wide variation of looks, all the way from some of them, the lower quality ones are like more of a peachy color, and then some of them get up into like a really, really bright orange tangerine saturation. and we just call them tangerine MLs whenever they have that orange coloration. And that is a recessive. That is an albinism, but it doesn't look like it. Like they are light sensitive, but if you just look at their eyes, they look black still, right? It's like there's such a deep ruby red, and it's not until you cross. And caramel is also an albinism, right? And it's not until you cross and make double recessive caramel amels do they have like an actual red eye, like you would in most of the
It's
albino,
crazy.
leopard geckos or some other albino animals. And I think it's just a matter of their eyes are so dark anyway. Like most normal fat tails, you can't even see any iris or pupil definition or anything. It's all just black.
Right.
So that's pretty cool there. So then you go on to Oreo. That's the axanthic of the fat tail world. So that's just a straight. It gets rid of all the reds and greens and blues from the color spectrum, and you just end up with grayscale. So they hatch straight black and white, just like a Max Snow or a Jim Snow or an Albie Snow would. And then, but cool thing about Oreos is they don't get any coloration. They stay, because they're true, axanthic. They stay just grayscale. So some of them will kind of, I call it silver up, and then some of them will stay a little more stark black and white. It just kind of depends on the lineage there. Some lines are more silvery, and basically it has to do with the tangerine influence. Lines that have a lot more tangerine influence are going to have a lot more silver hues to them, whereas lines that don't have as much tangerine influence are going to be able to stay a little bit more black, or a little more white on the background. Now, with that said, there's also differences in the way the dark pigment presents itself, meaning some lines will have more of like a chocolatey look to them once they mature, even though they hatch black and white. And then some lines will stay with that dark black pigment, right? Similar to like how the Black Knights are, how you have some that are like black, and then some that are more of a chocolatey look to them, right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
Different qualities.
And then Oreo, then you got patternless. Patternless is just like it sounds. It's basically just a brown gecko, the normal patternless. Some of the less interesting looking patternless look just like a turd, basically. I mean, it's just a little brown gecko. Don't have any markings on them at all. And they can, I never had a lot of interest in them originally because I didn't see the allure there. Now, as I'm working a little bit more with the other genetics and seeing how they look mixed with other stuff, and how different lines of just the patternless alone can have different hues to them and different shades to them, I'm getting more and more interested with working with them, and I have a lot of them in my collection at this point. But basically, I would like to have a patternless of every different color at this point. Like a solid white to solid black and everything in between. Sure, we'll get there one of these days.
Nice.
But so
yeah, Seth's gonna do it. Watch out for that.
Is that it has a marker that carries with it a lot of times called stinger and or zero. You'll hear it called both ways. Only difference between stinger and zero is the presence of the stripe. So if it has a stripe, it's called a zero, and if it doesn't have a stripe, typically it's called a stinger. Some people still call them all zeros. It doesn't really matter. Some people call them all stingers, as long as you know what you're talking about. But basically,
yeah, and that's just like a random thing that like pops up, right, with the head expression.
Well, yeah, yes and no. It seems to be attached to that gene in a lot of cases. But then sometimes you'll have het patternless that don't express any zero or stinger at all. So basically, most zeros or stingers, or the thought process is all zeros or stingers are het patternless, but not all het patternless are going to express the zero or stinger, right? However, with that said, I've hatched several animals in my collection that are expressing some crazy pattern aberrancies, or I mean, it looks just like zeros and stingers, that there is literally no chance of patternless being in there. I mean, unless some of my wild caughts are patternless, which is going to be my next step, is testing out, my wild caughts to, like, all of my original wild caughts to patternless stuff, because I'm getting a lot of little stinger looking aberrations on the patterns in a lot of my babies from the F1 and F2 pairings that I'm making from the wild caught stuff. And then I've got, like, I had a pairing that was a tangerine AML with absolutely no patternless in his lineage, and I paired him to a wild caught female, and I produced one animal that she's one of the most incredible looking zeros I've ever seen in my life, and she's maintained her pattern coloration throughout adulthood, which a lot of zeros, they'll hatch with like full saturation. And I guess I should explain what I mean by that. Whenever a zero hatches, basically the two bands are one. They just kind of they connect. Either they'll connect on the side or they'll connect down the middle to where it looks kind of like a bee stinger. Or if you're familiar with our next gene that we go to, the Zulu, some of them look very similar to Zulu markers. And so what it is, it basically just looks like a little arrowhead, or sometimes it looks just like a circle. It just depends on how they connect and how much they connect. So there's a lot of different expressions of that gene, and a lot of, in my opinion, a lot of misconceptions about how that gene works, just from what I'm seeing in my collection. And further testing will tell me more as I move further and test some of these wonky looking wild caught babies to patternless stuff, and test all my wild caught stuff to patternless stuff. And if I end up finding that one or more of my original wild caughts are patternless, that'll explain a lot of what I'm seeing here. But that is to be determined. I did the female that hatched that really weird het AML zero that I'm talking about. I did pair her to a patternless the next year, because that was my suspicion when I hatched that zero off her, was like, oh, you might be het patty. And so I put her to a whiteout patternless, and I did not hatch a single patternless. And I hatched a bunch of babies from her. But I hatched a bunch of zeros from her.
Super interesting.
But, she was to patternless, so it kind of made sense that she was hatching zeros at that point. It wasn't as, but she was throwing like some really, really full coverage zeros that made, a lot more expression than some other zeros. So I don't know. In conclusion, I think that we don't know as much as we think we know about fat tail genetics, and I think that there's still a lot to be learned as more and more people are working with them, and as more and more people are working with them on larger scales, and communicating more too. Because that's the thing, is like, a lot of people can work with them, but if everybody's staying tight-lipped and not talking to each other and communicating about what they're seeing and trying to keep stuff secretive, then it's not going to be a good, wholesome community, right? We're not going to have as much feedback and be able to learn from each other as much. So that's important, is to be able to continue, or start really, talking to each other and creating a space for that, which is something I don't think we have very much in the fat tail world. I think there's a few of us that talk amongst ourselves, but a lot of people are kind of secretive with their projects and with the way they do things. But whatever, teach their own. But I'm an open book, so if anybody has any questions, for sure message me. I'll be happy to spill all the secrets.
Yeah.
Not that I have any secrets. So that's the patternless and the Zulu, the Stingers zero complex, and I probably did a horrible job of explaining that. And if you want more clarification on that, please message me, and I'll send you to some places, some other resources that might clarify it a little bit better.
I think it makes sense to me, especially me coming into it, kind of being confused about how that worked. So
yeah, it's basically just a patternless marker, is what we understood. What we think we know about zero and Stinger is that it's a patternless marker, or a patternless marker. So originally they thought there was like a super Stinger and a patternless, and they were different, but they look exactly the same. So, But with that said, there's some patternless out there that don't ever throw any zeros or stingers at all whenever they're making heads.
Yeah.
Right. So it's kind of weird. It's almost like there's two different lines of patternless that were imported, which is by all means possible. But from everybody's working and experimentation, the two lines are compatible.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
Right.
Yeah.
So, it's kind of hard to know when you're dealing with something. Like I said, we don't have full traces on everything because most of the genes were imported. And so some stuff was imported as visuals. Some stuff might have been imported as heads from those same locales, and people didn't even know what they were working with when they had it until later on. So who knows? Check my power. Hang on a second. Apparently I'm not plugged in. All right. Now we're cooking. So then we get to the Zulu gene. Zulu is the last recessive. I think we were going over all the other ones, right? Zulu is the last recessive, and it's really interesting because it is a pattern and color changer. So it changes the pattern in connecting the bands, very similar to the way the stinger does, but it's a little bit more definitive. And a lot of times they'll have tail striping too. It'll kind of like carry into the tail. So you'll end up with a little point connecting the two bands and making like an arrowhead look. Actually, I have one right here. I'll just show you. Make a little arrowhead look, and then that is a good one too. And some of them are less expression than others, but this is a Zulu. So the patterns the bands are connected with that little stripe down the middle. So that's a Zulu. And then the tail. See how the tail has a little marking on it? That's pretty indicative to the Zulu. A zero or a stinger isn't going to have that. Okay. Another thing a zero stinger won't have is a lot of translucent belly scales like the Zulus have.
That's crazy.
Isn't that interesting? You can literally see right through them.
That's wild.
And that's something that only Zulus. Well, Zulus have a lot of translucent belly scales. You'll see some other fat tails that might have like one or two translucent belly scales, but it's nothing consistent like I just showed you there. So, and the other thing you might have noticed about that gecko is the different coloration. It wasn't just brown on brown, right? It had like more of a kind of a pastel-y look to it, right? It's like kind of a hue they get to them. So that's a really cool thing about the Zulus too. Let me see if I can grab this female to show you what I'm talking about on the color. She's a little bit bigger and more developed. So this is an adult female.
Okay. So
you see how the coloration is just a little bit more of
kind of like the ghost a little bit almost.
Yeah. Exactly. It's just not straight brown. The normals are just brown on brown, and these guys have a little bit lighter banding brown, and then their background is more of like a little pink hue to it.
Yeah, no, that's dope.
So that's the rundown on the genetics, Evan. I think we covered everything there. And then obviously you've got combos galore of everything. And there's a lot of combos that haven't even been made yet. There's, AML patties, Oreo patties. Oreo patties are really popular and been around for a while. Whiteout everything. Whiteout AML, whiteout Oreo, whiteout Ghost, whiteout Caramel, whiteout Zulu. Whiteout looks awesome on everything. It reduces the pattern and just kind of makes everything real wonky. I would compare whiteout to white and yellow in that sense, the way it kind of accents colors and twists the pattern around sometimes. I guess white and yellow doesn't mess with the pattern as much, but anyway. So yeah, combos of everything. Again, there's a lot of combos that aren't even out there yet or are just now starting to be produced visually, like AML Zulus is something pretty cool looking that I haven't even started working on yet. That's one combo I tried to make some heads for last year, but the female I had for that project didn't take, so I have to try again this fall. But lots of different stuff.
Which is also awesome for people getting into it because it means there's tons of just things to create, and lots of double, triple head.
Exactly.
Even more than that, if you're just stacking genes, there's like ton of market stability for that.
Yep. There's lots to be done, lots to be learned, and definitely plenty of room for people to find their niche and really take off.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like there's so many different avenues that you could go with these guys. And I think that's one thing that people are starting to realize. I feel like people have been kind of sleeping on this species, honestly. I think there's like I said, a lot to be done, a lot to be learned, and a lot of new looks still to be developed.
Yeah.
You know, that's one thing I'm working on is like some actual line breeding projects of trying to really focus on high tangerine animals, or like my mango project is, more of a high white background with the orange skirting and the bluing that stays in there. You know, that's kind of the traits that I've keyed in on that. A lot of lavender in the banding, stuff like that.
Bunch of black velvets too that are super awesome.
Yeah, those. Who knows what's going to happen with that? It might just be a one-off. That I've got these couple that are looking like they are. We're going to find out this year because I've got I've got a lot of animals dedicated to that project because it just. To explain what you're talking about there, the black velvet is a project that I kind of just popped up on me this year in a project that I was working on. So I was working on size, and it was called the Colossal Project, right? I have this gecko named Colossus, and he's huge. He's like 10 inches long. His head is like that big around. He's not fat at all, but he's like 100-gram gecko. And now keep in mind, there's no giant or anything in fat tails. You know, that doesn't exist. So what I wanted to do was try to create not a giant or anything, but just line breed a larger fat tail and try to focus on that size. So I took him and put him to my biggest patternless female, and he's an Oreo het patternless is the genetics on him. I put him to my biggest patternless female, and then I kept two of their patternless daughters and put them back to him. Now, that's not something I typically do a lot of with my fat tails. I'm all about genetic diversity with my fat tails, and like I mentioned, I do a lot of wild cutout crossings and try to really mix it up with all my pairings and have a lot of parallel linear projects to where I can go back and forth with very minimal relation. But with this particular project, I was like, all right, I started off with completely unrelated foundation animals, and I'm going to try to focus this in on making some big geckos, you know. Well, one of those daughters produced typical average stuff from him, from that pairing. The Oreo patties that they produced silvered out, most Oreo patties do. So they start out almost black when they hatch, and then as they mature, I call it silvering out. They just kind of like turn gray,
right?
Turn silver, and that's the typical way that those express. Well, the other sister, or daughter that went back to him, I noticed one of the Oreo patties that was growing up from her was staying just solid pitch black. I mean, just dark as night. And so then I noticed a younger sister of hers was almost as dark. So there's two Oreo patties from that pairing that I hatched that are darker than any Oreo patties I've ever seen out there in my life. So much so that, and to the point that they've stayed that dark even into maturity, they're now, 6 to 9 months old roughly, and should absolutely be at their adult coloration, and they're still, I mean, pretty damn black. They're not jet black, but they're close to it. And so obviously I'm going to try to key in on that now. So I'm calling that the Black Velvet Project. I'm dedicating a lot of space and time and energy to that project. I kept, from that exact pairing, I kept a 1.3. So I've got an Oreo het patty who I named Thor, and is going to outgrow his dad if I had to guess, because right now he's 9 months old, and I weighed him the other day. He was like 68 grams.
Man,
he's gonna be huge.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Again, not a fat or overfed gecko. I keep my geckos pretty lean. Okay, he's just big.
Man.
He's growing so fast. So anyway, that's the male I kept from that project. And then I kept the three females. I kept the two Oreo patties, and then I had a patty het Oreo that also has kind of a different look to her for a patty. And I think might be kind of what I'm keying in there that's keeping them so black. So I'm going to definitely move forward with that project. The mom to that 1.3, she went into ovulation here recently, and instead of making the same pairing again and putting her back to Colossus, I put Thor to her because I feel like Thor looks a little better than Colossus color wise. I feel like his black is blacker, and I'm more likely to get that out of her with that going to her. So we'll see. Like I said, a lot of inbreeding here on that project, and I'm definitely going to keep a close eye on it. And like actually, I already did some outcrossing this year. I have a patty het Oreo that is completely unrelated to either of those founding animals that started the Black Velvet Project, and I put her to Thor as well. So and also she's striped, so I'm gonna bring some striping into the project as well.
Nice, dude.
Because I think that'll look cool to have that contrast. Because the white stripes stay really white, so if we can get that really white on a really black, Oreo patty, I think it'll look awesome.
Yeah.
So that's my goal there. As far as releases on them, don't hold your breath because I'm going to be hoarding them for a while. I want to really try to refine this and see if I can get it actually presenting itself consistently before I try to sell it as something. Because I mean, at the end of the day, it's just Oreo patties, right? That's all they are. It's not a new gene. To be clear, the Black Velvet is just a project. It's not anything new. It's just a little bit different expression of this combo. And so that's what I'm trying to focus on is what is making it express that way. Why is it staying so dark? Because typically they silver out and these aren't.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited about that project, if you can't tell.
Yeah, for sure.
So Black Velvet and Mango are definitely my main focuses as far as like selectively breeding for crazy looking stuff and trying to really dial something in. And then like all those genetics I listed, I have in my collection. I've got everything at this point in my collection, either in a combo or most of them I have isolated. And that's it's one of my goals is to kind of have a line of isolated outcrossed of each genetic, because I feel like that's something that eventually is going to be very important in the fat tail community, because just like the leopard gecko world, people are stacking stuff on top of each other and have all these possible het this, possible het that, possible het this, and which is cool, that's fine. But I feel like eventually somebody's gonna be like, I need a pure patternless. I need a pure Oreo. I need a pure whatever.
Right.
And they're gonna know where to go for that if I can continue with what I'm trying to work on here. I'll have that library of genetics. Hopefully.
Yeah. If you guys haven't been able to tell already, he's already gone crazy. So it's getting everything.
Just a little
bit. Nice. Yeah. Well. Yeah. We talked about a lot of awesome things with the AFTs. I know you wanted to just talk about some of the issues that could possibly happen with African fat tail, so people kind of know what to expect if something goes downhill, and then being able to nurse them back to health if needed. You mentioned mouth injuries could be a possibility with some of the AFTs, and just some other few things.
Yeah. So, like I said, they're kind of derpy. They'll end up biting stupid stuff sometimes and grabbing their food bowl or their hide instead of the cricket they were shooting for. So they'll get little, busted teeth or infected teeth that you gotta help them with sometimes. More so than Leos, I find. I think they don't have as good of an aim as Leos, and they'll end up kind of just grabbing onto something they shouldn't be biting on sometimes. So I'll watch out for that. And the way obviously veterinary care, if it's out of your scope, is the go-to for sure. But if it is in your scope and you can give them something safe to bite on, like I use some really dense rubber or something for them to safely bite on to hold their mouth open, and then you can just kind of pop the cap off of that infected tooth and get some Neosporin packed in there, and a lot of times that'll clear it up. So that's one thing there with the mouth injuries.
Gotcha.
Some other things.
Prolapsing could happen.
Prolapse, just like with you get hemipenal prolapse, you get I had one female that actually was prolapsing. When she lay, she would prolapse. So we retired her and found a good, happy home for her. And then one other thing that can happen with the females, I've only seen it with fat tails, and I've only seen it with a select few females in my collection, and they're all kind of in one general lineage. So I think it might be something there. But sometimes some of my females will get these little like buildups in their glandular area right there, like post-cloacal glandular area.
Mm-hmm.
So where the penile bulge would be, that should just be soft to the touch on any gecko, but especially on a female. You shouldn't feel any structures in there, right?
Right.
So some of my females will get a little buildup in there, and it just feels like a little bitty, like tiny BB in there. You can just feel it kind of rolling around in there. If you touch it, it just feels hard. So one thing I've learned to do is just in my daily routine, whenever I'm doing a maintenance, just on a weekly maintenance, one thing I do is I pick the gecko up, and as they're coming off of me, I just kind of carefully palpate that area and feel if it's soft like it should be, or if I feel anything rolling around there. And the couple of females that I have that do it consistently get it. I have to check for them and expel something out of them like a couple times a year. Like every few months, they'll get a buildup that I have to pop out. And the way I get it out is just like you would remove a sperm plug, except it's actually a little easier than messing with a sperm plug because you don't have to worry about messing with the hemipenis at all. It's just a matter of moving that little mass of tissue in there or that little mass of cells or whatever it is. My vet and I think it's just like maybe shed that doesn't get pulled out of that area like it should. Like maybe, there's a pore right there that doesn't shed properly and it just builds up inside. I don't know. But you just have to kind of move that material towards the vent area, and there's a pore in there that it'll squeeze out of. But you have to catch it early enough for it to fit. If you hear this and go check and your gecko's got a big old like pea-sized lump in there and you can feel it's obviously hard, you're going to have to go to a vet for that. She's going to need some veterinary assistance. So that's one thing that I have not figured out the cause to it. My vet was thinking it could be hydration. I haven't found that to be the case because I keep everybody the same, and it's only a few select females that get it. So I don't know.
Yeah, interesting.
I've just mitigated it with the couple that I have that get it, and like there's one that I retired and sold, and I sold it to somebody local that we vent an expo there like 4 times a year. And so she just brings the gecko to me at every expo, and I check her to see if she's got it. And if she does, I pop it out and hand her back to her, and she's good to go. So, and I'm teaching her as we go too. So eventually she'll be able to do it on her own. So if anybody has any questions there and needs some assistance there, I can definitely try to help. By all means, I will put out there though, I'm not a vet and I'm not trying to give veterinary advice or anything like that. And like I said, if it's out of your scope, seek exotic veterinary care, qualified exotic veterinary care. But that's something that I've learned to deal with on my own in my collection. After having 3 surgeries, I think, to remove them, then I started figuring out, like, oh, okay, I need to stay on top of this and get it out prior to it being to that point. Yeah, I had one gecko that we had to operate on twice, and then another gecko that we had to operate on that now I just remove regularly. So yeah, it's definitely something that is to be on the lookout for. And I don't know if there's anything else. Evan, is there anything else?
I think we got to all of it. Yeah. And I think, we touched a lot on today. And like the last thing I just want to hear, like, why should everybody get a AFT? Like, what's the market looking like? How is it for new people getting in? Stability over time? Like, how does that look?
Well, as far as like something to work with, like if you're looking for a new project and something different, I highly recommend them because they're, like I said, they're more challenging than Leos. So it's not something that's run of the mill and just that everybody can do. And for that reason, I feel like the market has a little more stability because somebody can't just buy a project from you and turn around and be pumping them out the next year.
Right.
They might get lucky. They might get lucky and hit it good with a couple of girls they get from you. But first of all, they should be growing them out longer. And second of all, in my opinion, and second of all, they just aren't as prolific. On average, I probably get about 6 babies per girl, But again, some girls might not lay anything. Some girls might lay one clutch. I get a lot more single clutch girls or single egg clutch girls with my fat tails. So there's a lot of factors there that make it, I feel, a more stable market. And I've seen over the years a more stable market. That there's just not as many people working with them. It's as simple as that. So you don't get the flood of product like you do with leopard geckos at a certain time of year when everybody's just their babies because they're overwhelmed with too many. They made too many pairings and they hatched too many babies and they're I need to get rid of everything, and so they start dumping stuff. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't see that as much with fat tails. There's a few breeders out there that might just that's just kind of their how they do things. Like they just produce and sell them for cheaper just to get them out. But it's not so many people that it's like a saturated market, right? And again, there's so many projects yet to be worked on and yet to be refined and yet to be dialed in. And I hatched a baby the other day from a wild caught to wild caught. And there's another thing in the fat tails we didn't go over it with the genetics, but it's called a white socks. It happens very sporadically. Some people think it's recessive. Some people think it's whatever. I hatched from my Walcott to Walcott pairing a baby with a very distinct white sock rear left foot. So, who knows how that's expressing or how that's carrying. If it is recessive, then that's really, really crazy. Then I would have two Wildcocks that are recessive or het for it.
Yeah, definitely. And the fact that you could even get that, just better chance for you to just pop out random stuff that you can't get in the Leos.
But that's my point. Is like I feel like even just doing Walcott to Walcott stuff, there's still some cool stuff that you can see and that you can hatch out. I've got a couple of F2s. Yeah, I got F2 right here. There she is. And she, again, does not look normal coloration for a wild type fat tail. She's just got like kind of a golden hue to her, right? Not really a tangerine, more of a gold. And so that's a F1 to an F1 that produced that. So like there's so many different expressions and so many even though there's not as many different genes as you have with leopard geckos or ball pythons or whatever, I feel like with there being still combos that aren't even tapped into yet, I think there's still just a lot to be done and a lot to be worked with. So come on, I'm more than happy to share the animals if people want to work with them, because it's definitely lots of cool projects to be tinkering with.
Yeah, man, it's awesome that AFTs are booming. Like, seems like more people are getting interested in them, see them more at shows, and yeah, just people gotta get into it. I gotta get into it eventually.
I feel like they're really gaining some traction. I mean, people love their personalities. Whenever you stick them in people's hands and they just curl up and literally go to sleep right there in the middle of the show, people are like, "What?" And that's the majority of them. That really is their personality. I have a couple in here that are turds, but I mean, I've got a lot of fat tails, and I literally only have a handful that don't like to be handled. Most of them, and the way I explain it to people is, they're more reclusive than Leos. They're not going to be as outgoing and begging to come out as Leos. But once you get them out, they're more laid back and just ready to kind of hang out and watch TV with you, or curl up in your hand while you watch TV, as opposed to a leopard gecko that might be begging to come out, but then once you get it out, they might chill with you for 5 minutes and they're like, all right, I want to go find somewhere to explore and hide. And know, more explorative and rambunctious when you have them out, I find. Obviously, there's some outliers in both species, but
for sure,
for the most of them.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, that's awesome. If people just want to get to know you more in terms of the AFTs and chat, and check out more stuff and just ask you personal questions. I'm sure just a lot of people are gonna just be interested to learn more and hear your perspective about it. So what's the best way for them to get in contact with you for more information?
Well, we're doing shows regularly. We've got, I think, 20 shows slated this year. So you can catch us at a lot of different shows. We do the NIRBC Arlington show. We do several of the Herp shows, which is a local show that runs kind of here in Texas and Louisiana. We do the Reptilian Nation show that comes to Fort Worth and Houston. And then there's a couple of local shows that we do that we kind of fill in the blanks here. So that's honestly the best place to come get to know us and meet us, is at the shows, because then I just love face-to-face, interaction. Right. Obviously, if that's not an option, if you're on the other end of the country, shoot me a message. I prefer Messenger on Facebook or Instagram rather than email. But if email is your preferred method, shoot me an email, whatever. Yeah, I'm more than happy to chat and talk shop. I love just talking with people that are passionate about this species, or as passionate about the species, or even almost as passionate about the species as I am. By all means, and I do get busy sometimes, so if I don't hit you back right away, it's not definitely not ignoring you. Just kind of got to prioritize things and take them as they come. But yeah, reach out to me for sure. Huffs Herps on Instagram or Facebook, and then huffsherps@yahoo.com.
Awesome. Seth, you're the man. Killing it with the AFT. Super proud of what you're doing. Just keep up the good work, man.
Man, thanks for having me, Evan. I really enjoyed talking about them, and hopefully getting some information out there and giving people a better start on working with these guys than has been offered in the past.
Yeah.
That's honestly my hope, and that's why I stress. If there's anything that was unclear on this, or people have questions, reach out to me. I'm happy to clarify and give some more guidance when I can, where I can. And again, I'm not the know all end all. This isn't the only way to do things. This is just how I'm doing them and how I've kind of adjusted things to have success in my collection. So hopefully it's helpful to people, and hopefully it can bring people success and remove some frustration from the equation.
Definitely. Yeah, for sure, man. We'll catch you on the next episode. And again, appreciate your time, man.
All right, Evan, thanks for having me, dude. Have a good one.
All right. Yep. See ya.
Bye, bro.